Hi folks, it's Rob Flux here from Property Developer Network, coming to you for yet another Sunday session. This week's topic is going to be on flooded blocks and how to correctly assess them for their development potential and capability. So lots and lots to think about when it comes to flood sites. But firstly, it's probably a good place to start is to actually understand what it is that actually determines flood. And there are many, many different kinds of flooding in case people weren't actually aware. So firstly, flooding in itself typically comes from, I guess, the breaking of the banks of a river. Okay, now the river is generally, I guess, towards the bottom of the catchment. And so after a prolonged series of rain over quite a great deal of time, water eventually gets itself down to the river. But before it gets to the river, it actually does a couple of things beforehand. So the flooding of the river is typically where most people are expecting it to happen, but it also happens in the creeks and subsidiaries that actually feed the river. So all your little nooks and crannies and that sort of thing along the way that are actually catching it, and these small little creeks all add up to the next small creek, add up to the next small creek before it actually gets into the river itself. But before it gets into the creek or the waterway, then the next round of flooding is what is called overland flow. Now, overland flow is the path that water takes when it travels above the surface of the water before it actually gets to the creek. Now, in order to do that, rain falls from the sky. The ground actually absorbs some of that, and only at the point where the earth is actually saturated does it actually follow the contours of the earth in order to actually get to the creek and subsidiary in the very first place. And so all of those elements we tend to forget about, I guess, the feeding into the river, but the overland flow, creek and waterways, and the river flooding are generally the ones that we're primarily used to. On top of that, there are two others. So there's one called tidal inundation. So this is the regular and periodic inundation of the estuarine areas, typically where, I guess, at the mouth of a river where there are high tides. So at the mouth of a river, as it comes out into the ocean, as the ocean pushes back against that, we tend to get what is called tidal inundation. It pushes back up the river or up the creek. There is also a thing called storm tide flooding, and that is where, I guess, the combination of tide and storms both at the same time push against the natural flow of the river and push that and may also go up against, I guess, the sand dunes and things like that. But those sorts of things. So 5 different kinds, folks. So we have to be mindful of all of those when we're actually looking at our flooding inundation. Now, when we start to assess our flooding levels, there's probably some key terminology that we need to start to get ourselves used to. Now, this may vary very slightly from state to state and jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but at a very, very high level, we're going to have something along the lines of this. So there's a defined flood event. So this will be, I guess, what is deemed to be a flood event in the local jurisdiction that you have in your particular area. Now, when they define that flood event, they may only recognize certain kinds of those 5 levels that I actually mentioned. And when they do, I guess they will define how and when they, I guess, are going to be deemed. And they'll generally have some mapping that sits in around those defined flood events and what it is that that particular jurisdiction is actually concerned about. So if they're worried about tidal inundation, they would have some mapping that sits in around that tidal inundation. There is also a defined flood level. So this is I guess, the floor level, or I guess the height above sea level, as measured by, I guess, the Australian Height Datum, AHD, which is the height above sea level, that basically determines where the flood waters are going to get to typically. And I'll come to how that's actually defined in a couple of moments. But that defined flood level generally has, I guess, a 1 in 100 year event, a 1 in 50 year event, etc., etc. And so they know roughly where these watermarks are going to hit each and every time, I guess, on a statistical level. So that's what they're defined height levels become. Then there's a finished floor level, or I guess that is the height within the building itself that it is safe to actually have habitable areas. Okay, so this is the uppermost surface of the finished floor, not including any floor coverings, carpets, tiles, all that sort of stuff. But this is basically at this point that finished floor level should be I guess safely out of the water and above that defined flood level event. Okay. Now, there's also a flood hazard level, which is, I guess, the level. Sorry, let me touch on that one. I've missed one definition. My apologies. So there's a thing called a freeboard. So freeboard is once you get your defined flood level, you have a freeboard level, which is a buffer that sits on top of that. That buffer on top of that allows for things like statistical inaccuracies. It allows for things like debris floating. Sometimes there'll be trees and branches and things like that that actually float in the rivers. That freeboard area allows a margin of error above that finished floor, above that defined flood level, and then that becomes your flood hazard level. Okay, so that's the flood hazard level is then where your finished floor level tends to then land. So a couple of those areas kind of stack on top of each other. I've got a little bit of a diagram that's going to show that a little bit later that might flesh that out a little bit easier for you. Then there's two different kinds of impacts of water, okay? So there's a thing called the hydrodynamic action. So that is the action of fluid when it's actually in motion. So when water is moving or any other fluid, that's your hydrodynamic action. But there's also a thing called hydrostatic action, and that is the pressure exerted by a fluid when there is the force of gravity. So if you can imagine things like retaining walls or dams or things like that, where the water is being held back. So you might have, for example, a wall that might provide some resistance against that hydrodynamic action that creates some hydrostatic action. And eventually there's going to be a breaking point for that wall. So they're the bits of terminology. Next one you want to think about is what is defined as a habitable room. Now, I've pulled this out of the National Construction Code standards. So, and it will have a slight variation in each jurisdiction. But functionally, a habitable room, it includes things like bedrooms, living rooms, lounge rooms, music rooms, televisions, etc., etc. I guess where people actually habit the space, okay? And it will typically exclude things like bathrooms, laundries, pantries, walk-in robes, corridors, etc. Now, sometimes based on a house design, we tend to have those at the same level. But where you have flood areas, what you would actually be designing is a design where you've got the habitable areas above the non-habitable areas. So you can have things like storage areas downstairs, for example. You might have your laundry downstairs. So if that gets flooded, typically the people are going to be safe and it's not going to be that big of an issue. But if they're not, we want to make sure that the habitable areas are going to be high and dry, so to speak. Okay. So I touched on that flood hazard level before. So that is, I guess, the height above sea level that everything's going to be measured against. It's going to make sure that there are safety provisions with regards to that the freeboard area over and above that. Let me get to in a couple of seconds to a diagram that's going to map that out, that flood hazard level. But all of the levels that we're talking about here, they're all measured by a thing called the Australian Height Datum, or AHD. Now, you've probably heard the expression of height above sea level. Well, that is typically measured against the AHD. So the AHD is a national standard. So many, many moons ago, so somewhere before 1971 from memory, all the different jurisdictions and states measured their height above sea level very slightly differently. But back in May 1971, I guess the National Mapping Council of Australia got together, got a whole bunch of jurisdictions together and said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to standardize the height above sea level. And what they did is they took 30-odd tide gauges distributed all the way around Australia. They took 2 or 3 years worth of data for what was happening in and around those tide gauges, and then they standardize on what they deem to be baseline zero. Okay, so baseline zero is then where every other measurement is then determined from. So as you go higher and higher, you're going to be above sea level. It's possible, though, that you can actually be below sea level because as you leave the coast, you may go up over a mountain, and then as you go on the other side of the mountain, it may actually go below sea level. But because you're, I guess, protected by the mountain, you're not going to typically flood from ocean filling in and that sort of thing. So all of our measurements and contours are typically measured against that AHD. So now that we know those definitions and that sort of thing, what are the factors that actually contribute to a flood? Well, I guess the most obvious one, the one that comes to mind, is clearly rainfall. So rainfall is the most important factor in creating a flood, but there are many other impacts on that. So basically, when rain falls into a catchment area, and that's the key thing. So the catchment area is, I guess, a high point where any rain that hits that high point is then going to come towards the low point. And when you've got a couple of high points on either side, it's all going to fall towards the bottom. So that is your catchment, okay? So when we do that, when that rain hits that catchment area, depending upon the size of the area, is going to depend on the volume of water that is likely to be captured. It also depends on whether or not the rain is directly above the catchment. So if this is the catchment here, if the rain's directly above, we're going to capture absolutely everything. If the rain is slightly to one side, then we're only going to capture half of that into the catchment area. So where the clouds are, where the storm actually physically occurs, and so the likelihood of that actually occurring. And then within the catchment itself, then you've got characteristics such as what vegetation may actually be there, whether or not there are any hard surfaces like concrete and tarmacs and things like that, because they tend to not absorb things. But the vegetation, the ground, all of those sorts of things where, as I touched on before, the water can actually absorb into the earth itself. And so when you start to assess the likelihood of floods, what they tend to do is they tend to look at, firstly, the size of the catchment. Then they start to look at the likelihood of rain falling directly in the area, the likelihood of it falling 100% above the catchment, and what the surfaces of the catchment actually have contained within them. So you'll have a hydraulic engineer typically go and do measurements that will determine what that catchment area is. They'll look at the surfaces that sit in and around that. They'll have a look at the statistical likelihood of floods actually happening, of rainfall, I should say, happening within the area. And then what they'll do is they'll start to have a calculation, which is, I guess, it's called the AEP, the annual exceedance probability. And so what this is the likelihood of that catchment capturing 100% of the rain at any one point in time. And they tend to measure this in 100-year events. So they will measure this as a 1 in 100-year event, for example, which means the chances of it happening would be only once inside the 100 years. They might happen, I guess, a 2% chance, which would mean that every 50 years, there's likely to be a chance that hits the flood at that particular level. Then they would have a 5% chance, which would be every 20 years. So what would be the flooding levels every 20 years? And then also a 20% chance, which would be every 5 years. So basically what they do is they have a look at the catchment, they do the calculations on the AEP, and they work out what is the likelihood of the flood and what would be the AHD, or the height above sea level that water level is actually going to get to. They start to calculate all of those things, and what that then helps them to determine is things like the depth of the water. Okay, so how deep is it going to be? Now, obviously, the depth of the water is going to be relative to where your house is contained within that catchment. So if you imagine this catchment like this, if you're at the very, very bottom of the catchment, that's going to capture all of the water. And so when we say how much water is actually going to collect in there, you might be right in the middle of that. Whereas if you're halfway up the hill on the catchment, then the likelihood of you being completely inundated would be a little bit low. So the depth of the water is going to be measured, I guess, at different points on your block of land. And I guess based on that, you may find that you have varying levels of flood on that particular site. So you may have to deal with that in slightly different ways at the front of the block to the rear of the block and vice versa. The next thing that the hydraulic engineer starts to measure would be the velocity of the water. Okay, so how fast is the water actually traveling? Now, you've heard of things called flash floods. That's where water actually comes in a torrent. And because of the speed and the velocity of that water, whilst it may not be a huge amount of water, the actual speed of that is enough to knock you off your feet. It's enough to knock trees over, pick up cars, move cars, all those sorts of things. And so the velocity of the water is actually quite, I guess, a critical factor in the capability and what you can do in and around your site. Now, in calculating that, they obviously have to see, well, where are you in that catchment? If you are at the bottom and you're on its way towards, I guess, the creek or subsidiary, then that is going to be clearly very distinctly in your path. If you're just off to the side and you're not in that overland flow path, then chances are you're actually not going to be impacted majorly by that. So I guess your proximity to the overland flow path has a massive impact on that. The next thing that they would start to consider is the time it takes to rise and fall. So the flooding at the bottom of the catchment, is it going to take a long time to rise and a long time to fall, or is it going to go up and then down really quickly? Now, what that does is it has an impact on, well, how long are you likely to be trapped inside that flooded property? And so if you're going to be trapped in there for weeks at a time, because it's going to take a very long time for that flood level to dissipate, that clearly has some health and safety issues, the ability for emergency services to get to you on the property, the ability for you to get food, those sorts of things. And so strangely, the faster it rises and falls, the more likely you are to actually have that accepted by your local authority as an acceptable standard. If it takes a very long time to rise and a very long time to fall, or worse, not very long to rise and a long time to fall, then that might be something that your particular jurisdiction is not really fond of, okay? The next one they're going to look at is flood-free access to the block. So when we're looking at flood-free access, we're looking at the front of the property and the ability for things like emergency services, so police, fire, ambulance, that sort of thing, to be able to get to the property in case somebody is trapped, in case they have some health emergencies, those sorts of things. We don't want to be helicoptering in all the time in order to save people that are in flood areas. And so depending upon the level of flood-free access, and again, that's impacted by how quickly it rises, how quickly it falls, and also the velocity of the water. Depending upon those levels, if you cannot get flood-free access to the block, your local jurisdiction may not actually allow that. So always look at, when you look at your mapping services, to see, I guess, the depth of the water, which is typically measured in different colors on your map. So the darker the color blue, typically the deeper the water is. If it's very light blue, chances are that it's not very deep at all. So when you start to look at the levels of flooding that you've actually got, then you want to start to see how much of that block is actually impacted. And that may mean if it's only a portion of the frontage, maybe you can move your driveway to the other side, for example, so you can actually still get on and off the block. So those sorts of things might have a massive impact. Then we're going to start to look at things like, I guess, will there be, will the design of the house, so the materials that we actually construct the house under, are they going to mean that we're going to have things like the house on stilts so that water passes all the way under? Is it going to be, I guess, close to the ground, in which case it might create a little bit more of a solid surface, which might mean that water is going to hit it and go around it. So we need to have a look at, I guess, the strength of the foundations, the materials that are actually being used. Is that going to be timber? Is that going to be steel? Is that going to be concrete? Is it going to be brick? Those sorts of things. So the structural design and structural integrity of not only the house, but also the foundations of the house. Your hydraulic engineer will then start to have a look at, will the water actually need to pass under the house, in which case we need to have that buffer that I was talking about before, that what is called freeboard, that will allow things like floating debris to come down and pass underneath the house without actually capturing things like quite often we have services underneath, like your sewerage and that sort of thing underneath the house. So you don't want a branch to come through and capture that and tear out all your plumbing. You don't want it to hit things like your electrical services. So you want to make sure that all your electrical switchboard and that sort of thing is well out of the flood path, that sort of thing. So do we want the water to go under the house, or do we want it to actually go around the house? In which case, do we need to actually build the house up, put some dirt and fill and actually lift the level of the basic ground underneath the house so that the house itself is 100% free? Now, if we do that, what that means is if the water passes under us, then clearly the path that the water was always on will stay true to its course. It's going to pass all the way through and we're not going to impact that. If, however, we put something on the ground, whether it be fill that fills us up or a solid retaining wall or something along those lines, is going to cause the water to actually deviate or redirect, then we need to start to consider what is the impact on our neighbours, okay? Now, if you are going to have an impact on your neighbours, you'll not only have to need to do a hydraulic report before to understand, I guess, the speed and depth of the water and the like, but we'll also have to do one after we've actually done a house design. So we'll have to make sure that there is a no worsening effect on our neighbours, and in doing so, because what we don't want to do is we push our water so that we're safe, and then the next door neighbour who wasn't previously impacted suddenly is, or maybe they were impacted and now they're suddenly more adversely impacted. So we want to be really, really careful when it comes to those elements. Now, what I said before is I was going to touch on a thing called the habitable floor area. And so what I want to do now is just do a very quick screen share with you. This came out of a document from what used to be called the National Construction Code, and they're now called ABCD, and I'll touch on those in a sec. But this came out of one of their documents. So effectively what we've got is the non-habitable floor level all the way down the bottom. So this is what is going to be your storage areas. This is going to be your laundry areas, things like that. Then you've got a defined flood level. Now, in this instance, it's saying 1 metre, but depending upon your particular jurisdiction, they may have a different minimum standard for that. But effectively, that flood level will be the height above sea level, or the AHD level that is going to be in the area. Then there will be what is the freeboard. So the freeboard is the gap between that flood level and the safety level that allows debris and that sort of thing to float, and also a margin of error for the statistical calculations to say what happens if the flood level is actually slightly incorrect. And then that then becomes your flood hazard level, which typically becomes your habitable floor level. And from that level, then you can then have a habitable house that sits on top of that. So those little terminologies that I touched on before, that's kind of how they play out, I guess, diagrammatically, so you can actually see how and where that's going. Now, what you will typically find is this freeboard level will vary based on what is the source of the flooding. So I touched on the 5 different sources before, because the impact of that source might have a slightly different effect. So if it's just a small creek, then the impact of that water might be much, much lower. Whereas if it's the bursting of a giant river, then there's going to be a lot more water. So they may say that that freeboard level varies depending upon the source of the data, the source of the flooding. So watch out for that in your particular jurisdiction. Okay. They may also say that freeboard level will vary statistically based on that AEP level, or the anticipated exceedance level. So how often it's going to happen in a 100-year event. So in your jurisdiction, they may say, look, you need to have something that is better than I guess a 2% chance, or every 50 years, and they may define a freeboard level for that. but they may, if you get flooded very, very regularly, that may change to a 1 in 100 year event, for example. So that's how it's represented diagrammatically. What I thought I'd do is show you an example of a house that has been built that is flood immune. So here is one here. So it's a 2-story house where you can see that underneath here, there's actually a whole bunch of slats. Instead of a normal car park or a normal garage, there's a whole bunch of slats where water can actually pass underneath the house. So this is deemed to be a non-habitable area. It's deemed to be storage. So no humans are actually living in that area or interacting in that space. You may have laundry or storage or those other things that I touched on before. And then you've got your habitable height here, and then you've got your dwelling above. Now note that you're going to have to keep under your I guess maximum height level for your particular area. Some areas that's 8.5 meters, some areas it's 9.5 meters. But what you'll need to do is make sure that you can actually keep peak of the roof underneath your maximum building height level. Now, in order to do that in this particular instance, you'll notice that the pitch of the roof is quite shallow. So they've kept that shallow roof like that, so to keep the height of the building down. If they had had a very high pitch, that would have made the height of the building go up. So there you go. That's I guess an example of what can be done. Now, there are many, many examples of how this can be done. It could equally be built where you actually put some fill on the property and they, I guess, build the house on the top of the fill. So it's actually on a mound. So that's another example. Now, if you're wanting to do a little bit more homework on this, here is a little bit of a clue for you. So Australian Building Codes Board, so ABCB, they have a document called the Construction of Buildings in Flood Hazard Areas document. So this is a standard that you can actually download, and it is basically the building codes to say how you're actually going to build a particular flood-free property. It's about a 80-odd page document. It's actually a relatively easy read for anyone wanting to do that. So you don't need to know, I guess, the building standards. Your engineer is going to know that, but this is going to give you some guides on what is and isn't required, how you're actually going to achieve that. But what I can say is that you can build in flood areas in some particular instance, so long as you can make sure that the habitable height that we touched on before is actually going to be, I guess, easily achieved, and that there's going to be, I guess, a level of flood-free access based on the speed of the water, the height of the water, and how often that actually occurs, and the source of the water. Okay, that said, folks, I'm going to go take some questions from the group in a moment. But in the meantime, just wanted to remind you, we run these Sunday sessions every single Sunday, 5 p.m. Brisbane time. Looks like I've got a little glitch here with my link, so I'll fix that up next time. So 5 p.m. Brisbane time. Always make sure you come and actually like our Facebook page. If you like our Facebook page, you will actually get the alerts every single time I go live. And we also republish these on our YouTube channel. So go to YouTube and search for Property Developer Network, and you'll find those YouTube recordings. We generally get those up within a week or so of doing these recordings here. Reminder also that we have a couple of Facebook groups. So our Property Developer Network group, that's where you can actually ask help from our community, and the community will actually try to help you on your particular journey. And Development Site Deal Hub, where we have off-market opportunities. So it's a great place for you to go buy a project that's off-market, or one for you to sell if you've got one off-market. Alternatively, great place to go and find investors and that sort of thing if you are looking to try and do the project yourself and just looking for someone to help you out on that journey. So that said, what I'm going to do now, folks, is I'm just going to see what questions have actually come through from our community, see if we can try and help you out, and see what questions we've got. Give me 2 seconds while I just try to see what questions have come through. Facebook doing its normal thing and being a little bit tricky in giving us who's got questions. So lots of people asking. A lot of people saying hello. So I'll say hello very generally back rather than naming everybody. So Jane's asked, what would the additional construction costs of this would be, please? Really difficult one to answer, Jane, because it really comes down to, I guess, the engineering level that needs to solve the particular flood on the site. So what we really need to do is actually get ourselves a hydraulic engineer. That hydraulic engineer is going to say what the, I guess, the amount of flooding, the speed of the flooding, and how quickly it goes up and down. Once you've got that, you can then hand that to your architect to see whether or not he can actually design something outside of the flood level. And then they will then hand that to the engineer to see what has to be done in order to do that. So there's no one direct answer to do that. But if you're able to build something on stumps, it's going to be significantly cheaper than putting fill down. But depending upon the area that you're living in, that may not be aesthetically pleasing or suit the character of that area. So a tricky one to answer, but it could have anything from a $5,000 to $100,000 impact. So that's how wide the range actually is. The key point being, and what I should have touched on before, and my humble apologies, key point being that you want to get those flood levels done by your hydraulic engineer, but in many instances, the local jurisdiction actually has a lot of that mapping already done. So, for example, Brisbane City Council has a thing called Floodwise Mapping, where you can actually get a report that says for your particular property, how much flood levels are anticipated on your site. Excuse me, I've got a very itchy nose, so I'm going to give that a really good hard scratch right now, and hopefully I won't have to do that again. Hopefully that helps, Jane. I know it's very generic advice, but I guess it's as it, you know, how long is a piece of string, unfortunately. A lot of other people saying hello, so I'm just going to say hello back again. Luke's saying fantastic. Thank you, mate. My good friend Eve. Hello, Eve. How are you? From the other side of the planet over there in Perth. So folks, I can't see many questions coming through once again. You guys are being very shy the last couple of weeks. So I'm going to give you a couple of moments to see what questions you may have before I have a very quiet night by the sound of it. Now, some other interesting things that are happening in and around our jurisdiction, so in and around our community, I should say, whilst I am talking to you. Some fantastic news with regards to a software platform that I've been working on for quite some time called National Property Data. Now, I'm not going to put a link in here at this very particular moment, but what I do want to tell you is we are creating a brand spanking new software platform that we hope to launch in the first quarter of 2021. And that is going to I guess, start to look at property data in a very, very different way. So it's going to be looking at data from multiple sources to see what we can and how we can actually extrapolate data that aren't being done by some of the other platforms out there. So we're going to look at, I guess you start with your basic sales research tools and then add other layers on top of there. So that is going to help you with your zoning. It's going to help you with particularly finding particular kinds of projects. So watch this space for national property data. We're actually doing a capital raise on that at the moment, if for anyone who's looking to become an investor in that platform. So I guess reach out to me privately or watch for the post that I'm about to do on that on Monday inside of our Facebook group, folks. So that said, still no questions coming through. You guys are being extraordinarily shy today. So as there is no question, there doesn't appear to be much reason for me to actually hang around. So that being the case, I am going to bid you all farewell, and I'll see you next week for another Sunday session. Thanks, folks. Bye for now. Whoops.